The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the county jail's processing area, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Officer Richard Wilson stood at his desk, his badge reflecting the artificial light as he shuffled through paperwork. 10 years on the job had left their mark, not in wisdom or patience, but in a growing list of disciplinary warnings tucked away in his personnel file. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. The usual parade of overnight arrests filed through. A drunk driver sobering up in holding, 2 guys who got into a fight outside a bar, and a handful of petty offenses that would likely be sorted out by afternoon court. But something about today felt different. The air was thick with tension, like the heaviness before a storm. Around 9:30 am, the door buzzed open. 2 patrol officers led in a young black man in handcuffs, arrested for what should have been a simple traffic stop, a broken taillight and an alleged failure to signal. The man, we'll call him TJ, stood tall despite the circumstances, his pressed work uniform and company ID badge suggesting he'd been on his way to his job when everything went sideways. Wilson barely looked up from his paperwork as TJ approached the processing desk. He'd done this thousands of times, the same questions, the same forms, the same procedure. But today was different. TJ, though respectful, wasn't staying quiet about what he saw as an unjust arrest. "Sir, I had my signal on. I use it every day on that turn. And my taillight was working fine yesterday," TJ explained, his voice steady but frustrated. "I'm going to be late for work. I've never even had a parking ticket before." Wilson's jaw tightened. He didn't like when they talked back. In his mind, anyone who ended up here deserved to be here. The growing stack of complaints against him, excessive force, racial bias, unnecessary roughness, had done nothing to change his attitude. If anything, they'd made him worse, more defensive, more angry at a world he saw as increasingly disrespectful of his authority. Other officers in the processing area started paying attention. They could feel it too, that familiar tension when Wilson dealt with someone who didn't immediately submit to his authority. Officer Chen, a rookie just 3 months on the job, shifted uncomfortably at her desk. She'd heard the whispers about Wilson, seen the way some of the older officers shook their heads when he was assigned to processing. "Listen here," Wilson growled, finally looking up. His face had that red tinge his colleagues have learned to watch for, the warning sign that things might go bad. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job. You're here because you broke the law, and now you're going to shut up and do what you're told." TJ took a deep breath. He knew this game. As a black man in America, he'd been coached since childhood about how to handle encounters with law enforcement. Stay calm. Be respectful but firm. Know your rights. He worked as a supervisor at a shipping company, had a degree in business management, and had never been in trouble with the law. But none of that mattered right now. "Officer," he said carefully, "I understand you have a job to do. I'm just trying to explain my situation. I have rights, and I'm not raising my voice or being disrespectful." The words hung in the air like smoke. Officer Chen found herself holding her breath. Another officer, Veterans Affairs Rodriguez, who'd been doing paperwork nearby, slowly stood up. They'd all seen this before, moments where everything could either calm down or explode in an instant. Wilson's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, his face now fully flushed. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder, the air growing thicker with each passing second. Security cameras mounted in the corners of the room continued their silent vigil, their red lights blinking steadily, recording everything that was about to unfold. Nobody in that room could have predicted how the next few moments would change not just their lives, but the entire department. As Wilson stepped around his desk, his hands clenching into fists, the security cameras kept rolling, capturing every movement, every expression, every choice that would soon be scrutinized by millions. The stage was set for an incident that would expose long-hidden problems within the department and spark a conversation about accountability that couldn't be ignored. But in that moment, as Wilson moved toward TJ, no one knew they were about to witness something that would make headlines across the country and force their community to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and justice. The processing room had become eerily quiet. Even the usual background noise, shuffling papers, ringing phones, radio chatter, seemed to fade away as Officer Wilson squared off with TJ. Every person in that room could feel the tension building, like electricity before a lightning strike. Officer Chen found herself gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had turned white. In just 3 months on the job, she'd learned to read these situations, and everything about this one felt wrong. She caught Officer Rodriguez's eye across the room, seeing her own concern mirrored in his expression. Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran, had seen plenty of situations go bad, but something about this one felt different. "I said, you need to shut your mouth," Wilson growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He'd moved close enough now that TJ could smell the coffee on his breath. The handcuffs bit into TJ's wrists as he instinctively tried to maintain some distance, taking a small step backward. "Sir," TJ said, his voice remaining steady despite the situation, "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to understand why I'm being processed when my taillight was working fine yesterday." He stood straight, his work uniform still crisp despite the morning's events, his company ID badge a reminder of the life being disrupted by this encounter. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. 9:42 a.m. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. Wilson's face had turned an even deeper shade of red, a vein pulsing visibly in his temple. His hand kept twitching toward his belt, a gesture that made everyone in the room nervous. "You people always think you know better," Wilson spat out, taking another step closer. "Always questioning authority, always making excuses." The words hung in the air, heavy with prejudice that made several officers shift uncomfortably. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Wilson," he said quietly, "maybe I should take over the processing." He'd seen that look in Wilson's eyes before, had watched similar situations spiral out of control. But Wilson acted like he hadn't heard him, his attention locked solely on TJ. TJ took another careful breath. He thought about his family, his mother who'd always told him to keep his cool no matter what, his little sister who was about to graduate college, his nephew who looked up to him. He thought about his job, where he supervised a team of 30 people, handled million-dollar shipments, and had never had a single complaint against him. "Officer," he said, his voice still calm but firm, "I understand you're doing your job, but I have the right to ask questions about my arrest. I'm not resisting. I'm not being disrespectful. I'm just trying to understand what's happening." The processing room had grown even quieter, if that was possible. Other inmates in holding cells had pressed against their bars, watching the scene unfold. Even they could sense something was wrong. Officer Chen had quietly pressed the panic button under her desk, summoning backup without drawing attention. Wilson's next words came out in a near whisper, but everyone heard them clearly. "You want to understand what's happening? I'll show you exactly what happens to people who don't know their place." Officer Rodriguez was already moving forward, reaching for Wilson's shoulder. "That's enough," he started to say, but Wilson shrugged him off violently. The sudden movement made TJ flinch, though he managed to keep his composure. 2 more officers appeared in the doorway, drawn by Chen's silent alarm. They assessed the situation quickly, but before they could intervene, Wilson had backed TJ against the processing desk. TJ's handcuffs rattled against the metal surface as he tried to maintain his balance without making any sudden movements. "I have rights," TJ said, his voice finally showing a trace of fear. "This isn't right, and you know it." His eyes darted to the security cameras in the corners of the room, their red lights still blinking steadily. Little did he know those same cameras would soon become crucial witnesses to what was about to unfold. The clock showed 9:45 a.m. 3 minutes had passed since Wilson first stood up, though it felt like hours. The air in the room had become thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. Officer Chen had her hand on her radio, ready to call for more backup. Rodriguez was moving closer, trying to defuse the situation without setting Wilson off. But Wilson was beyond reaching now. His face had taken on a look that his fellow officers would later describe as completely detached from reality. His body language had changed, becoming more aggressive, more threatening. Every person in that room could sense that they were seconds away from a point of no return. The security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every detail of these crucial moments. The way Wilson's hands clenched and unclenched, the subtle shift in his stance, the look of growing concern on TJ's face. In just a few seconds, these cameras would capture something that would shock the conscience of the entire community and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the thin line between authority and abuse. What happened next would replay in everyone's minds for months to come. The processing room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the clock hit 9:46 a.m., marking the moment everything changed. Officer Rodriguez was just 3 steps away when he saw Wilson's body tense. "Don't!" He started to shout, but it was too late. In a burst of uncontrolled rage, Wilson suddenly lurched forward, driving his forehead directly into TJ's face. The sound of the impact echoed through the processing room like a thunderclap. Time seemed to slow down. Officer Chen's coffee mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. The crash mixed with the collective gasps of everyone in the room. TJ, still in handcuffs, stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose. His work ID badge, now spattered red, swung wildly from his shirt. "Get him!" Wilson shouted, trying to spin the narrative even as it unfolded. "He tried to attack me." But nobody moved to help Wilson. Instead, Rodriguez and the other officers rushed forward to protect TJ, who had somehow managed to stay on his feet despite being handcuffed and injured. "Stop. That's enough." Rodriguez's voice boomed through the room as he positioned himself between Wilson and TJ. The younger officers quickly moved to support him, forming a human barrier. Wilson stood there, chest heaving, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights, seemingly shocked that no one was backing his play. Officer Chen rushed to TJ's side with a handful of tissues, her hands shaking but her training kicking in. "Stay still," she said softly, helping him sit down. "Medical's on the way." She noticed his work uniform was now stained with blood, the name tag showing his supervisor position at the shipping company partially obscured. The other inmates in the holding cells had gone completely silent, witnesses to a scene they never expected to see. One older man shook his head slowly, muttering, "They got it all on camera. Thank God they got it all on camera." Wilson seemed to suddenly realize the gravity of what he'd done. His eyes darted to the security cameras, their red lights still blinking steadily. The same cameras he'd walked past every day for years were now silent witnesses to his undoing. His face, previously flushed with anger, began to pale. "He attacked me first," Wilson insisted, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You all saw it. He was resisting." The words fell flat in the stunned silence of the room. Even the newest rookie could see through the lie. TJ sat quietly, accepting the medical attention from the newly arrived paramedics. Despite the pain and blood, his dignity remained intact. He didn't shout or curse. He didn't make threats. He simply looked Wilson in the eye and said, "The camera saw everything, officer. Everything." The processing room had become a flurry of activity. Supervising officers rushed in, responding to the emergency calls. Photos were taken. Statements were being gathered. Officer Rodriguez had already started writing his report, his hand steady as he documented every detail of what he'd witnessed. "Get him out of here," the watch commander ordered, pointing at Wilson. 2 officers escorted Wilson to another area, his protests growing weaker with each step. The reality of his actions was finally starting to sink in. The paramedics worked efficiently, cleaning and assessing TJ's injuries. "You'll need X-rays," one of them said, "but nothing appears to be broken." It seemed like a small mercy in the midst of such chaos. Officer Chen found herself gathering TJ's belongings, carefully placing his phone, wallet, and other personal items in an evidence bag. Each item told a story: family photos, a business card showing his management position, a receipt from the coffee shop he'd visited before being pulled over. All reminders of the normal life that had been violently interrupted. Down the hall, the watch commander was already on the phone with Internal Affairs. "Yes, sir, we have it all on video," he was saying. "Multiple cameras, multiple angles." "No, sir, there's no question about what happened. None at all." The clock now read 10:15 a.m. In less than an hour, a routine traffic stop had escalated into an incident that would make national headlines. The security footage would be watched by millions, sparking conversations about police brutality, accountability, and the urgent need for reform. As TJ was helped onto a stretcher, Officer Rodriguez noticed something that had fallen under the desk during the chaos: TJ's work schedule. The paper showed he was supposed to be leading a team meeting at 10:30 a.m. discussing shipment logistics for a major client. Instead, he was heading to the hospital, another victim of a system that had failed to weed out a dangerous officer despite numerous warning signs. The processing room slowly returned to its normal routine, but nothing would ever be quite the same. The incident had torn away the thin veneer of normality, exposing the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath the surface. As the cleaning crew mopped up the blood from the floor, everyone knew that this was more than just another incident report. This was the moment everything would change. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of the precinct's report writing room, casting striped shadows across Officer Wilson's face as he sat at his computer. His hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as he began typing his version of events. The clock on the wall showed 2:30 p.m., just hours after the incident that would soon shake the entire department to its core. Subject became increasingly aggressive during processing, Wilson typed, pausing to massage his temples. Despite multiple verbal warnings, the subject maintained a confrontational attitude and made threatening movements toward this officer. The lies flowed easier with each keystroke, years of writing reports helping him craft a narrative that painted himself as the victim. Down the hall, in the break room, two rookie officers, Officers Parker and Reynolds, sat nursing cold cups of coffee. They'd been present during the incident, standing near the back of the processing room. Now, Wilson had cornered them separately, pressuring them to back his story. "Look," Wilson had told Parker earlier, his voice low and persuasive. "We've got to stick together here. You know how these things go. If we don't watch each other's backs, who will?" The young officer had shifted uncomfortably, thinking about his mortgage, his new baby at home, and his future in the department. Reynolds had received similar treatment. "You're new here," Wilson had reminded him. "Your probationary period isn't even over. Think carefully about whose side you want to be on." The threat, though veiled, was clear. Meanwhile, TJ sat in a holding cell, his face still throbbing from the assault. The medical report documented his injuries: a bruised nose, split lip, and potential concussion. But instead of receiving proper medical attention, he'd been placed in solitary confinement, allegedly for his own protection, but really to keep him isolated and unable to communicate with anyone about what had happened. Back in the report writing room, Wilson continued his fabrication. Subject attempted to headbutt this officer, forcing this officer to take defensive action. He read the words back to himself, trying to convince himself of their truth. The security camera's red lights blinked silently overhead, but Wilson had convinced himself that the footage would be too grainy, too unclear to contradict his story. Officer Chen sat at her own desk, her hands shaking as she worked on her incident report. Unlike Wilson's version, hers told the truth, every brutal detail of what she'd witnessed. But before she could save it, her supervisor appeared at her shoulder. "The report needs to go through proper channels," he said, his tone careful but firm. "Why don't you take a break? Wilson's handling the primary paperwork on this one." Chen felt her stomach twist, recognizing the politics at play, the unspoken pressure to fall in line. In the precinct's locker room, Officer Rodriguez paced back and forth, his conscience weighing heavy. He'd seen everything, had tried to prevent it, but now faced the age-old blue wall of silence. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife asking about dinner plans, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the morning's events. The cover-up machine was running at full speed. Wilson's supporters in the department had already begun spreading rumors about TJ's violent history, though none existed. They suggested that drugs must have been involved, despite the fact that TJ's drug test would come back completely clean. The narrative was being carefully constructed, brick by brick, lie by lie. In the evidence room, the security footage sat unreviewed, its digital timestamp marking the truth that no one had yet seen. The technician responsible for archiving such footage had been told to hold off on uploading it to the system. Technical difficulties, they called it. Just another small piece of the cover-up puzzle. Officer Parker finally succumbed to the pressure, adding his statement to support Wilson's version of events. "From my position, the subject appeared confrontational," he wrote, each word feeling like a betrayal of his oath to serve and protect. Reynolds followed suit shortly after, his statement vague enough to neither directly lie nor tell the truth. The day shift was ending, and the night shift began filtering in. Rumors and whispers spread through the department like smoke. Some officers avoided eye contact with each other, not wanting to be drawn into conversations about what they'd heard. Others huddled in small groups, discussing the official version of events they were expected to support. In his cell, TJ lay on the thin mattress, his thoughts with his family who still didn't know where he was. His phone call had been delayed due to processing issues. He touched his swollen face gently, wincing at the pain, but more hurt by the injustice of it all. The truth was being buried, and he felt powerless to stop it. What none of them knew was that truth has a way of finding the light. As the sun set on that first day, as reports were filed and stories were aligned, as the machinery of cover-up ground forward, something was already in motion. In just 72 hours, every carefully constructed lie would come crashing down, and the truth captured by those silent cameras would expose not just one officer's actions, but an entire system's willingness to hide it. 3 days after the incident, Lieutenant Harris sat in the dimly lit Internal Affairs office, his morning coffee growing cold beside him. The wall clock ticked past 8:15 a.m. as he began his routine review of incident reports. 23 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the processing room incident didn't sit right. "Let's see the footage," he said to the tech specialist, Officer Martinez, who was pulling up the security camera feeds. "All angles, full audio." Martinez nodded, typing commands into the computer. The processing room appeared on the large monitor, crystal clear in high definition. "They said the cameras were having technical issues," Martinez commented, raising an eyebrow. "Funny how they're working perfectly fine now." The timestamp showed 9:30 a.m., the beginning of the incident. The footage was surprisingly clear, every detail, every word, every movement captured in perfect clarity. As they watched, the color drained from Lieutenant Harris's face. The video showed no aggressive moves from TJ, no threatening behavior, nothing to justify what happened. Instead, they watched Wilson's escalating anger, his aggressive stance, and finally, the unprovoked headbutt that sent TJ stumbling backward. "Play that again," Harris ordered, his voice tight. Martinez rewound the footage, and they watched the sequence a second time. Then a third. Each viewing made it clearer. This was no self-defense situation. This was assault, plain and simple. "Get me every report filed about this incident," Harris commanded, reaching for his phone. "And start uploading backups of this footage to secure servers." Now, he'd seen cover-ups before, had watched good evidence mysteriously disappear. Not this time. Within an hour, Internal Affairs office was buzzing with activity. Reports were spread across tables, their contradictions now glaringly obvious. Wilson's account claimed self-defense. Officers Parker and Reynolds had provided vague, non-committal statements. But Officer Chen's preliminary report draft, the one that had been held for review, told a completely different story. By 10 o'clock a.m., the police chief had been called in. The footage played on the conference room screen as senior staff watched in stunned silence. The chief's face grew darker with each passing moment. When the video ended, he stood up, straightening his uniform. "Place Wilson on immediate administrative leave," he ordered, "and get me everything, his personnel file, previous complaints, all of it." The chief had seen the writing on the wall. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about to become a major scandal. In another part of the building, Officer Rodriguez sat with Internal Affairs investigators, finally able to tell the truth. "I tried to stop it," he explained, his relief at speaking openly visible on his face. "I knew Wilson was escalating the situation, but it happened so fast." The revelation rippled through the department like a shockwave. Officers who had stayed quiet began coming forward. Previous incidents involving Wilson emerged, complaints that had been buried, warnings that had been ignored. The wall of silence was cracking. Meanwhile, in the evidence room, Martinez worked methodically, creating multiple copies of the footage. Each backup was carefully documented and secured. Too many times, crucial evidence had vanished in cases like this. He wasn't taking any chances. By early afternoon, news of the footage had reached local media. Reporters gathered outside the police station, their satellite trucks lining the street. Inside, the chief prepared for a press conference, knowing this would be one of the hardest moments of his career. TJ, still in solitary confinement, had no idea what was unfolding. He sat in his cell, unaware that the truth was finally coming to light. The bruises on his face were starting to fade, but the memory of that morning remained vivid. Officer Chen was called into Internal Affairs next. As she watched the footage, tears welled up in her eyes. "That's exactly what happened," she said quietly. "That's what I tried to report. The weight of the past 3 days, the pressure to stay quiet, the guilt of compliance, all lifted from her shoulders." The footage didn't just show the assault, it showed the aftermath. It captured Wilson's immediate attempt to create a false narrative. It showed how other officers had rushed to protect Ihie, not restrain him. Most importantly, it showed the truth that no amount of paperwork could hide. By late afternoon, Wilson was escorted from the building, his badge and gun surrendered. He kept his head down, avoiding the cameras that had gathered outside. The same cameras he'd ignored in the processing room had brought his career to an end. Lieutenant Harris sat back in his chair, reviewing the day's events. On his desk, TJ's file lay open, a clean record, a steady job, a life interrupted by one officer's uncontrolled rage. Next to it sat Wilson's personnel file, thick with warning signs that should have been heeded long ago. The sun was setting as Harris finished his report. The footage had done more than expose one incident, it had pulled back the curtain on a system that had allowed it to happen. As he typed his final recommendations, he knew this case would change things. The truth, captured in high definition, would make sure of that. The district attorney's office buzzed with activity as the morning sun streamed through the windows. Files were spread across the conference room table, the security footage playing on a loop on the large screen. District Attorney Powell stood at the head of the table, her expression grave as she addressed her team. "What we're looking at here isn't just assault," she said, gesturing to the frozen image of Wilson's attack. "This is about abuse of power, false reporting, and attempted cover-up." The team of prosecutors nodded, already drafting charges in their notebooks. Across town, TJ sat in his living room, finally free from solitary confinement. His face was healing, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. His attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Mr. Thompson, sat across from him, reviewing the footage on a laptop. "They're going to try to settle this quietly," Thompson explained, closing the laptop. "But this isn't just about money. This is about changing the system." TG nodded, thinking about all the others who might have faced similar treatment without cameras present. Back at the police department, Internal Affairs had taken over an entire floor. Lieutenant Harris and his team worked through stacks of previous complaints against Wilson. The pattern was clear, a history of aggression, particularly toward minorities, that had been systematically downplayed or ignored. "Look at this," Officer Martinez said, pulling up a file. 3 excessive force complaints in the past year alone, all marked unfounded without proper investigation. Harris shook his head, realizing how deep the problem went. The media coverage had exploded. National news networks picked up the story, playing the footage that showed the assault and subsequent cover-up attempt. Outside the police station, protesters gathered, their signs demanding accountability and reform. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had supported Wilson's false narrative now faced their own investigations. Parker and Reynolds, the rookie officers who had given vague statements, sat nervously in Internal Affairs, finally telling the truth about the pressure they'd faced to stay quiet. "He said my career would be over if I didn't back him up," Parker admitted, his voice shaking. "I knew it was wrong, but I was scared." Reynolds nodded in agreement, both officers now understanding the cost of their silence. Officer Chen had become an unexpected hero in the department. Her attempted honest report, though initially suppressed, had helped corroborate the video evidence. Other officers began coming to her, sharing their own stories of witnessed misconduct they'd been afraid to report. The district attorney's investigation expanded beyond Wilson. 2 supervising officers who had helped suppress initial reports were placed on administrative leave. The evidence technician who had claimed technical difficulties with the footage faced disciplinary action. TG's story resonated across the country. His composed demeanor during the assault, his professional background, and the clear video evidence made it impossible to ignore the reality of police brutality. Civil rights organizations rallied around his case, seeing it as a chance for real change. The police chief called a department-wide meeting. The usually crowded briefing room was silent as he addressed his officers. "We failed," he said simply. "We failed our community, we failed our oath, and we failed ourselves by allowing this culture of silence to exist." New policies were immediately implemented. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers. An independent review board was established to investigate complaints. Training programs were overhauled, with emphasis on de-escalation and bias recognition. Wilson's case moved quickly through the system. The evidence was overwhelming. The crystal-clear footage, the attempted cover-up, the history of complaints. The district attorney's office rejected all plea deals, determined to make an example of this case. In the courthouse, TJ sat with his attorney, watching Wilson's arraignment. The former officer looked small in his civilian clothes, his arrogance replaced by the realization that his actions had finally caught up with him. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of the charges and the abuse of authority. The ripple effects continued. Other departments across the country began reviewing their own complaint procedures. Police unions, usually quick to defend officers, remained notably silent on this case. The video had made the truth undeniable. Officer Rodriguez, who had tried to intervene during the assault, became involved in training new officers. "Your first loyalty," he would tell them, "is to the truth and to what's right, not to protecting bad officers." As the sun set on another long day of investigations, Lieutenant Harris sat in his office, reviewing the changes already taking place. New reporting procedures, enhanced oversight, mandatory psychological evaluations, all sparked by one incident captured on camera. TJ's bruises had faded, but his determination hadn't. He started speaking at community forums, sharing his story, pushing for continued reform. His quiet dignity and forgiveness, coupled with his insistence on systemic change, made him a powerful voice for progress. The case became a turning point, a moment when the blue wall of silence cracked, when truth prevailed over protection, when real change began. And it all started with a simple traffic stop, a security camera, and the courage of those who finally stood up and said, "Enough." 18 months after the incident, the courthouse was packed for Wilson's sentencing. TJ sat in the front row, his family beside him, watching as the former officer stood before the judge. The security footage that had exposed everything played one final time in the courtroom, its images now familiar to everyone present. "The court sentences you to 18 months in state prison," the judge announced, her voice firm. "Following your release, you will be barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity." Wilson, no longer wearing his badge with pride, simply nodded. The man who had once terrorized others now looked small and defeated. Outside the courthouse, TJ faced a crowd of reporters. His suit was crisp, his demeanor calm, the same composure he'd shown during the assault now serving him as a voice for change. "This isn't about revenge," he told them. "This is about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The settlement from his civil lawsuit had been substantial, but TJ had bigger plans than personal gain. In a renovated downtown building, he established the Justice Reform Center, a non-profit organization dedicated to police accountability and community relations. The center's lobby displayed the famous security footage on a loop, not to shame, but to educate. Back at the county jail, changes were everywhere. New cameras with improved audio recording had been installed throughout the facility. Officers wore body cameras at all times, but the biggest changes weren't technological. They were cultural. Officer Chen, now promoted to sergeant, led training sessions for new recruits. "Your strength isn't in your authority," she would tell them. "It's in your humanity." Her experience during the incident had transformed her into a powerful advocate for reform. The police department had undergone a complete overhaul. The chief, true to his word, had implemented sweeping changes. An independent oversight committee, made up of community members and law enforcement experts, reviewed all use-of-force incidents. Regular psychological evaluations became mandatory for all officers. Officer Rodriguez walked through the processing room where it had all happened. The space looked different now, brighter, more open, with clear signs posting prisoners' rights in multiple languages. New officers trained here learned about the incident as a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked. In the district attorney's office, a special unit had been created to investigate police misconduct. The wall of silence that had protected bad officers for so long was crumbling. Other departments across the country began adopting similar reforms, using this case as a model for change. The rookie officers who had initially backed Wilson's false story had found their voices. Parker and Reynolds now spoke at police academies, sharing their experience about the pressure to conform and the importance of moral courage. Their honesty about their initial mistakes made their message even more powerful. TJ's Justice Reform Center became a hub for positive change. Former officers worked alongside community activists. Youth programs brought teenagers and police officers together for honest discussions. The center's research team tracked department statistics, ensuring transparency and accountability. One afternoon, a young officer visited the center. He had been inspired to join the force after watching TJ's story on the news. "I want to be part of the solution," he told TJ. "I want to show people that good cops still exist." TJ smiled, recognizing the sincerity in the young man's words. The local community had changed too. The relationship between police and citizens, once strained by mistrust, began to heal. Community policing programs flourished. Officers got to know the neighborhoods they served, not just as patrol areas, but as communities of real people. The security cameras that had captured the assaults still blinked their red lights in the processing room, but they now represented protection rather than surveillance. New officers learned to see them as tools for accountability, not threats to their authority. Wilson, serving his sentence, had time to reflect on his actions. He began writing letters to TJ, to his former department, to the community he had failed to serve. Some saw it as too little, too late, but others recognized it as part of the healing process. 2 years after the incident, TJ stood at a podium, addressing a national conference on police reform. Behind him, a screen showed key statistics. Complaints down 60%, use of force incidents reduced by 70%, community trust levels at an all-time high. "Change isn't easy," he told the audience, "but it's necessary. One person's actions can reveal deep problems, but one person's courage can also spark real solutions." He spoke about forgiveness, about moving forward, about building bridges between law enforcement and communities. The Justice Reform Center expanded to other cities, its model of cooperation and accountability proving successful across the country. TJ's story became part of police training nationwide, not just as a warning, but as a lesson in how positive change can emerge from negative events. Looking back, that moment in the processing room had become more than just an incident of police brutality. It had become a catalyst for transformation, a turning point where one man's dignity in the face of injustice had helped create a better system for everyone. The security footage that captured those few violent seconds had sparked years of positive change, proving that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures.